Welcome to the Restore for Life show, where wetlands thrive and wonders grow. From tiny tadpoles to reeds so tall, we'll dive into the magic that binds it all. Meet Sam Tofts, who will be your host through the story of wetlands, where science, stories, and inspiring insights come together. Let's uncover the importance of these ecosystems.
Hello and welcome back to the Restore for Life podcast. On today's episode, we will look back on almost 50 years of experience in conservation and its implications accumulated by our star guest, Paul Goriup. Paul's work ranges from his roles as the Director of Conservation at BirdLife International to his establishment of FIELDFARE International Ecological Development, which raises private capital for pro-nature projects. Our discussion circles around conservation, ecology, biodiversity, sustainable development, and finance, all of them from Paul's first-hand perspective in his career and projects, which are full of learnt lessons, ideas and solutions, all of which are useful for the present time as well as for the future. Paul, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, well, thank you, Sam. It's going to be a pleasure, I'm sure.
Absolutely. So, Paul, you've had quite an extensive career within the ecological and conservation sector. Were you always interested in nature growing up?
Oh, yeah. I grew up in Cyprus, and my mum was keen on taking myself and my little brother on walks around, a bit like Jerry Durrell in a way. We grew up with nature. We were collecting lizards to look after. We found an injured magpie once that had fallen out of a nest, and we looked after that. We were always chasing after butterflies, and I continued that when we came back to the UK to start school when I was 6. And went through butterflies and into birds.
The natural progression, I'm sure. I only just noticed that FIELDFARE is a species of bird.
That's right. Yeah, it's a bit of a pun because I wanted to have equity for people who are working in the field, particularly farmers and other people who use natural resources. So that's what it is. But it's a pretty common bird in Eastern Europe and going north into Scandinavia. Winter visitor here in the UK. And as its name suggests, it is very much a rural arable field bird.
So where did this love of birds take you later on?
Well, when I was at school, it was a hobby. And when I finished school and was looking for universities courses, actually, when I started in the 70s to go to university, there was no ecology courses, which is what I wanted to do. So I did a joint honours in Botany and Zoology, and because of my love of birds and butterflies and all things animal, the zoology bit wasn't too hard, and I concentrated on botany, but kept birding as my hobby. And from there, I joined under contract the Nature Conservancy Council, as it was then called. Now it's Natural England, and started doing surveys of waterways and aquatic plants, which is where my wetland experience started. But I could only do that in the summer. And in the winter, I was stationed at a place called Porton Down, which was formerly a chemical defence establishment site where nasty, noxious chemicals were tested and antidotes found. And in order for them to do that, they had a huge range, which was used for military exercises against chemical defence exercises. But most of the time it was vacant and it had never been ploughed, a huge chalk grassland area near to Salisbury. And that site had been chosen by an organisation called the Great Bustard Trust to try and reintroduce great bustards to the UK. They started in 1980, which was the year of in the environment for the Council of Europe, and they did this to market in Britain. And since I was there, I like birds, so I started to get involved with that Great Bustard project and took over the management of the birds. And eventually I managed to get them to breed for the first time. They hadn't bred in Britain since 1832, so you can do the sums. It's quite
Quite
a
a
long
historic
time.
moment then.
Yeah. And they paid for me to go on a visit to Portugal to look at the birds in the wild. Whilst great bustards have activity patterns which are mainly crepuscular, mostly in the morning and evening. So I had
Sorry,
lots of time for other birding.
what kind of bird is a bustard for those that don't know?
It's the world's largest flying land bird, heaviest, I should say, perhaps. The males can weigh up to 40 kilos. It's a relative of the cranes. It's a very old group of birds. They're mostly found in Africa as species. So Corey bustard, Rubel's bustards, and so on. They're African, but the great bustard came in to Europe with the recession of the ice ages and colonized. They like these big grassland areas. So when you look at them, well, they're very large. They look. Some people compare them to turkeys, which I detest. They're much more like sort of well-patterned waterfowl, like a big goose. I think would probably be closer to the mark, or a swan.
Okay. Much better reputation than turkeys, I guess. The swans and geese.
Well, they're just more beautiful for a start.
And it was a successful introduction, I take it, because I believe they're on the flag of Wiltshire now.
Eventually, yes. I mean, after 50 years of effort, the original stock of the Great Bustard Trust eventually all died out. They died out more or less in parallel with the original founders, who were all kind of Wiltshire aristocrats who were putting money into the project. But their idea of getting the reintroduction done was just to have the bustards in a large enclosure on Porton Down, expecting them to breed, and the young would just fly out because all the adults were pinioned. But it's actually a lot more complicated than that. And the project was restarted about 25 years ago under the direction of a guy called David Waters, who's a local lad, very enthusiastic. And we managed to get some more stock, first from Russia and then from Spain. And we adopted a much more hands-on approach. And now we have about 60 birds out on the plain, breeding
Amazing.
freely.
No input necessary, I guess.
Well, we're still doing what we call a reinforcement, which means that bustards, they like to nest in well-covered arable fields. So we actually get areas growing alfalfa and they go in there. But that alpha has to be harvested at some point. And sometimes, if it's going to be an early harvest, we have to collect the eggs to avoid them being mown.
I see.
So we go out with a drone, which has got a thermal imager on it. We can detect the nests, collect the eggs, and those we rear. The eggs are actually hatched at the Cotswold Wildlife Trust, and then they come back to the release site. We rear them and release them when they're about 3 months old.
Okay. And then kind of moving on from birds, you started to get a bit more involved in the more sort of financial side of projects, how to fund these, how to invest in nature. How did that all start for you?
Well, sort of the continuum from bustards was that I started traveling widely in the world to look at bustards, going all across North Africa and through Asia into Australia. They're a Palearctic and Oriental group, looking at different reintroduction projects, and also working on the fact that Arab aristocracy like to hunt them with falcons, a specific species called the houbara. And I was doing that with WWF. At that time, BirdLife International was still called the International Council for Bird Preservation. And it was decided by their membership in the mid-80s, or rather early 80s, that it should be more professionalized. So they set up a secretariat in Cambridge. A good friend of mine, Nigel Collar, went to work there preparing the Red Data books. He'd also been involved with the project in Portland Down initially. And when the issue came up of sorting out the conservation projects that ICBP was doing, he suggested that I come in. So I was asked to come back from Melbourne, where I was at the time, and do 6 months to try and sort out and organise their programme. And I actually spent 5 years doing that then, from 1982 to 86.
Bit longer than you expected to.
Yeah. And I left to set up NatureBureau as a company with colleagues, because I got quite frustrated first with the government work I'd been doing, and then with the NGO work I'd been doing, because so much time in those bigger organizations tended to be used, I felt, not very efficiently, and I just wanted to do projects. So NatureBureau was set up really to help them do their projects as a bureau, come in and do short-term work.
Where would you say the inefficiencies lied?
No, just people having endless meetings to discuss strategy, and quite often there was more emotion than science involved. In conservation, which I've always said is more of a social science than, and ecology is the sort of the technical bit of it. But in conservation, you tend to have passionate people who want to save the planet, which is fine. I mean, I'm not against that, obviously. But it's sometimes, people have completely different approaches, and trying to get that all into a consensus can be very difficult. And sometimes you go off in a bit of the wrong direction. And quite often more scientific rigor, like ecosystem services, the way energy flows around ecosystems, the kind of things you do as an ecologist, they get lost. And the focus becomes more on funding and doing projects as a way of building up a reputation rather than getting a job done.
For those that don't know, could you maybe just explain what ecosystem services are for us?
Well, ecosystem services that comes out of the Millennium Ecosystem Report. It's a way of trying to codify the benefits we get from nature. So we have three main types: cultural, which is the intangibles, and cultural stuff like enjoying nature, well-being, bird watching, photography, getting into nature. It can be religious, having taboo areas, for example, so that we have this intangible natural heritage under the World Heritage Convention. So it's those kind of services. What makes you feel happy to be out, really. Then you have provisioning services. These are the ones that provide us with our food, with our materials, so that we can make things. And the third category is what's called regulation and maintenance. These are the services which are much more dynamic, in the sense that you regulate populations, or you regulate water levels, you maintain certain habitats, and these are the natural processes where the energy is flowing backwards and forwards. And that's really, in some ways, the weakest bit of ecology, because there are so many of these different processes. It's very difficult to predict what you're going to get when you try to harness it. And each of those are divided then again into biotic and abiotic types. There's an international classification of those, and there's about 90 of them, of these categories. And now more and more organizations try to map their activities onto these ecosystem services.
Okay. And you say, was there a bit of disparity between sort of the ecology and conservation argument regarding this? Or...
Yeah, well, I mean, when I qualified, I mentioned there was no degree in ecology, but there was a master's in conservation science at University College London, which I attended. Felt very privileged to get onto that, actually. And we learned a lot in that. the first part of the course involved, if you like, an introduction to lots of different things away from your speciality. So there were only two naturalists on that course, myself and one other person who was more into botany. And the others were geographers, landscape architects, foresters, mathematicians, social scientists. And we went on third-year courses in law, geography, landscape architecture, and you suddenly realize that in conservation, you're integrating a whole load of different specialities and skills. And we were trained to write management plans in which you have to take account of people's wishes, really, for a protected area. You know, protected areas are set up by people. They don't occur in nature per se. It's not like, we identify them, we say we want to protect this heritage. And quite often we're talking, especially in Britain, about pretty much semi-natural habitat the whole time, which has arisen through the history of human use and occupation. And to keep things in certain states that we like, we have to apply, yes, ecological principles, but we also have to engage local communities in that. And the ecology helps, but ecology dictates that everything should go through a series of stages and come to a climax, succession theory. And if we did that in the Britain and we didn't interfere with nature like in rewilding, you'll always end up with a forest, especially since we don't have many browsers anymore. So you've got to integrate this mix. And sometimes ecologists and conservationists have different approaches, and it can be tricky. There are skills involved, I think, in bringing these two communities together.
So it's kind of like an accepting of the fact that society is interacting with nature at the same time. It can't be a perfect natural system everywhere.
Yeah, and in our work here, so where NGOs quite rightly try to hold governments and the rest of society to account to maintain a proper level of biodiversity and ecosystem services associated with that, and they push the ratchet up, and other people are trying to sort of exploit things too much, at either end of the extremes. What you end up with, of course, is a legal framework. So if you like, the settled opinion of people in a particular nation as to what they want to have in looking after habitats and species is what they write in the law. So in Europe, which is a fairly liberal place, we have the nature directives, Habitats Directive, Birds Directive. Other directives are now the new Nature Restoration Regulation. These all are world-leading pieces of legislation. They have a lot of flaws, as all laws do. They're very much vested in the science of the 1990s and 1980s. But nevertheless, they have created an enormous and valuable resource of more or less protected areas. And within that, of course, Restore for Life is doing its bit to enhance and improve the techniques that we have for restoring wetlands.
So, how would you describe to people how your role fits in with Restore for Life?
Well, we're going back to that question about finance, which I never answered.
We are, yeah. There we go.
So there was a point in NatureBureau, which is both doing these nature conservation projects, because I'm really a person who likes to do projects rather than sitting at a desk designing them and letting other people have the fun. But I was convinced that we also did, especially in those earlier days, didn't do a very good job of communicating what conservation and ecology is really all about to the folk who want to see improvements in nature. So half of the company is actually design, and the other half is ecology science, both marine and terrestrial. And our design team, they produce all sorts of information materials for different organizations, from our IUCN, Wetlands International, local wildlife trusts, and so on. But we also publish a lot of books for organizations, some of them quite technical, but also a lot of popular books. In our time, we've done over 100 titles, ranging from a guide to the insects of Britain and Northern Ireland, of the Mediterranean, plant atlases, important bird area directories, and so on and so on. So we were trying to improve, doing a project involves, if you like, a lot of ecology, but getting it to actually succeed involves a lot of communication. So I wanted to combine them both with colleagues. After a few years, the Bureau has been, it's 35 years old now, it's still going, and still giving us a living. But it was, if you like, I was starting to do projects, particularly in the Danube Delta, where there was a growing interest in this whole idea of sustainable use and trying to do investment in using nature in a sustainable way. And every single one of those projects ended up having lots of very good reports about how we might do this, but it never provided the capital to actually do them. There was no financing mechanism attached. So the projects were grant funded, usually by the EU, but also by international banks, European Investment Bank, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and so on. So they would do, if you like, the pathfinding, but then actual bankable projects were needed. It was quite hard to get that pipeline going. And I felt this was an area where, having had some experience in all the sectors, government, private sector, NGO, maybe I could do something about it. So I started this company, FIELDFARE, to test whether it's feasible to have these type of just straightforward, commercial, but sustainable investments, as we were all talking about. Because I kept hearing that this is what we have to do with the project. The project would stop, and I had all these feasibility studies which looked quite bankable, but nobody wanted to bank them. So I raised some money to start looking at ecotourism and biomass recycling in the Danube Delta. There's a problem in the Danube Delta with overly mature, far too stable, overgrown reed beds, which were being burned. And that was just at the time that carbon reductions were being talked about. And I thought, well, maybe we could do something with that. So in both ecotourism and reed pelleting, which is what we ended up doing, we proved that it can be done. But it's a very few things that you can do under the conventional system we have at the moment, because the returns are quite small. You need a lot of good skilled people, which is hard to find in rural areas. So we learned a lot of lessons from that. And I was then most recently invited to join Restore for Life to handle one of the work packages, which is looking at how we can get businesses more involved with nature-based solutions and ecosystem service managers. So I'm bringing that background to the project.
And so is there anything else aside from sort of ecotourism and biomass at all? Or...
Well, you have the conventional things, obviously, organic farming, organic fisheries. You've got, so those are the primary things, the primary products, if you like, from nature, from which we get wood, food, energy. But there are secondary things as well. We all know about, for example, pharmaceuticals coming from wild plants, medicinal herbs, honey production. We have the possibility, particularly in large amounts of biomass, which you can get from cellulose or from plant material, to make bioplastics. We can also get ethanol from it just as easily as growing maize. And what always disappoints me is that it seems much more easier to get funding to grow some exotic plants, some of these exotic grasses which people are growing, and they completely overlook our own natural resources, because somehow, as soon as you want to harvest reeds, for example, some organizations start to saying, oh, well, this is bad for the environment because you're destroying natural habitat. But actually, 9 times out of 10, it's not that natural, especially in Europe. So actually, by not managing them, either by grazing or harvesting, I mean, to replace the animals that used to do that in the past, Przhevalsky's horses or tarpons and so on. I mean, we only have deer now, really, which are browsers. So it's difficult to maintain grasslands just because we don't have the grazing animals anymore, no more oryx. So in many ways, you're reintroducing a management system which actually increases the biodiversity when you use something.
Okay.
There we go.
And so do you think being able to raise private capital, it sort of unlocks a lot more, let's say, restoration than just waiting on grants and funding from external organizations?
So even businesses in the early stages quite often need grants and subsidies to go up the innovation chain, as it's called, start, proof of principle, doing the pilot studies. You don't often get much capital for that. Most seed capital comes in when you've actually got something that works. So the research bit of it, the innovation bit of it, is quite often done in the universities. And then it gets a bit of seed capital through incubators, and then you go on. But there comes a point when that isn't enough. It's not sufficient. And the only way to go after that is either with massive public funding for example, nuclear power, or the private sector coming in and really trying to roll things out at scale. I mean, that's what happens in agriculture with these big mega food production companies, and forestry, it's happening, especially because of carbon. But at the kind of levels that we're looking at, it's very difficult to mobilize private sector financing because the risks are difficult to define. The capital investment at the beginning of a project is usually very high, and it's difficult to generate a sufficient return to return the capital within an investable period of time, which would be 5 to 8 years. The margins are small. I mean, we found all of this. If you try to keep the project relatively small, the sort of things that NGOs do with their membership and grant money, you can, but it then gets very spotty. And it also is hard because different organizations want to conserve different things in different ways. And then you end up with a mosaic of projects which are not easily linked together. So when we start talking about building corridors and connectivity, we start to find, well, it's just a patchwork, and how on earth are you going to link this all up together? So yeah, there's a lot of difficult problems that still have to be solved.
So what would you say are the kind of the main actions that sort of us as society should aim for to help with this?
I think there are things. The biggest problem is to solve with trying to blend these different funding streams better. So big projects, especially for delivering ecosystem services which are public goods, like clean water, good soils, rich biodiverse areas that people can go to enjoy,
which have an economic value as it is, right?
They have some economic value, but nowhere near what you would need to make a financial return. There's no park which is self-funded, really. Even in ecotourism, you'll find the companies, except for the few biggest ones, most of them are multi-dimensional. So they do the tours. If they've got the money and they've built or bought accommodation, that's where you get your hard cash flow from. And the tours are, because they're so time limited. If you're going to do bird tours in Europe, you've basically got from the middle of April to the middle of June when the spring migration is on, and then a very short period in the autumn migration, and the rest, you're lucky if you can break even with the number of people you can bring in. But you've got nice places and people will come to stay in the accommodation. But if you don't have accommodation, it's a difficult model. Anyway, I was saying we need to blend these streams of finance better so that for example, we've been looking in Restore for Life at an example where the state water company in Hungary realigned a flood protection embankment along the Tisza River because it was too close to the river and they needed more space for the increased amount of water that's coming down that river now with climate change.
Mm-hmm.
The lowest part of it keeps water, but it's a bit isolated from the river. And the idea is to put in a little bit of money from the fishing organization, the anglers organization, to make a small sluice and a canal, which would keep that wet area linked to the main river, and then use it as a spawning ground to get a place where fish can lay their eggs, get the fingerlings going, and then discharge them back into the river as a restocking instead of doing it all by artificial means in a fish farm. And that gives value to that piece of land. Of course, if it's maintained as a wetland instead of drying out in the floodplain, it gives you a lot of biodiversity in terms of plants, amphibians, birds, insects, dragonflies, for example. So that's looking quite good. And we've been able to work a cost-benefit analysis for that to show that it's economically interesting for both, but doesn't involve any cash. I mean, essentially, it saves them money. So it's like a negative. It's a negative revenue in the sense that by using it like that, the water authority gets to have control over the floodplain, and the fish will keep the vegetation down, so they don't have tall reeds growing up, for example, which would impede the flow of water and hold it back, therefore increasing the flood area. While the fishing people get young fingerlings and fish stocked into the river, which they wouldn't have to pay for.
So it generates income as well.
Well, it offsets cost.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
That's a slightly different. And I think that in nature conservation and finance, it's this offsetting of cost, because it's easy to see how you can make a revenue from growing food, but nobody takes account of the cost in terms of the nitrogen that you put in, which then pollutes the groundwater, which then causes problems downstream for people who have babies. So it's actually much easier to define these intangibles in terms of the cost people that have to be avoided than it is trying to think about how you can make money in terms of actual hard cash.
I see. Well, Paul, that's about all we have time for at the moment, I think. But as usual, we like to finish it off with some kind of recommendation for you, something you find inspiring or could inspire others. Do you have anything for us?
I don't know about inspiring, but I've generally found that I really love satire, political satire, environmental satire, because I think sending us up from time to time gives us a good sort of grounding in where we're really going. And,
I feel like us Brits do like satire. So.
I mean, yes, Monty Python and
yeah.
etc. So I think, and sometimes satire is satirized. I mean, the kind of world we're living in at the moment is very difficult to satire. I don't know what the satirists are going to write in future about this current period, but there's a book called Stark by Ben Elton, which I read a few years ago, and it just gave me a belly laugh on almost every page. And it was so good. It's about a group of mega wealthy people who buy some land in Western Australia near Perth. It's maintained by Aboriginals, and the whole idea is that they're going to build a launching pad there to have a rocket that will set up a kind of space station where some 500 people, of the wealthiest, of course, will live while the planet goes through an apocalyptic period. And it just seemed so far-fetched at the time. And it covers a whole range of issues and really sends them up in terms of just what people say about it. And as I said, it was so funny. Ben Elton, for people who don't know him, he's a very good comedian in Britain.
Okay. Well, we'll put a link to that in our show notes.
Yeah. I just want to finish by saying, written in 1989, I would never have believed that 36 years later it's still relevant. And even, I mean, now with people like Musk and Trump, it just seems, how on earth did you know that was all going to happen?
I know that it is kind of scary, this predictiveness in some of the old books.
Yeah.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for joining us and sharing some of your insight with us. We'll, as usual, put a link to that book in our show notes. Well, thank you very much.
Been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Sam, and a big thanks to our listeners tuning in to the Restore for Life podcast. If what you've been listening to is of interest to you and you'd like to learn more about Restore for Life, you should check out our website and our social media, which can be found in the description of this podcast. Until next time.